of the 10 minutes that I have. But let me just say, the subject that you've asked us to have a conversation around is quite broad. And so I was struggling to look at particular angles, maybe to respond to it. But I have put down a few ideas that I would like to share with you in the hope that it can spark some conversation. British colonization, or Western colonization, as I would like to put it, has clearly had a great impact on South African life. It is known that the British colony of South Africa came about in 1806, and later with the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, the colony became the province of the Cape of Good Hope. The British wanted to control South Africa because it was one of the trade routes to India. However, when gold and diamonds were discovered between the 1860s and 1880s, the interest in the region increased. It was around that same time that tensions started to flare up between the British and the Boers. So many factors contributed to the tension, but it should be noted that the question of the indigenous people was never expressed significantly, and this simply because the native, for all kinds of reasons, didn't matter. We have furthermore also seen how white supremacy could be used as a rallying point against Black self-determination. I suppose this for me is enough reason to speak not so much of British colonization, but of Western colonization of South Africa. Now, the closing years of the 19th century witnessed the consummation of European imperial ambitions in the complete dismemberment and colonization. Colonial conquest and imposition of violent European rule on the partially destroyed and suppressed indigenous societies, and the inserting of Africa into the modern European capitalist world as a dependent appendage to it, effected decisive breaks and distortions in the previous patterns of life prevalent on the continent at large. The likes of Basil Davison argued that, for instance, the colonial period in European mythology was supposed to have effected that particular transition from pre-colonial to modern society, but it generally failed in doing that. Thus, historically, the colonial period was a hiatus, an interlude, when African history was stopped or was forced to become, for that period, a part of European history. African historical existence was suppressed, and Africa was forced to become the negative underbelly for European history. The Eritrean philosopher Sero Kubirhan avers that what is paradoxical about all of this is the fact that Europe undertook the domination of Africa and the world not in the explicit and cynical recognition of its imperial interest, but in a delusion that it was spreading civilization. It thus refers to Rudyard Kipling's poem titled A White Man's Burden. A few words from this poem are essential in helping us understand this perverted psychology of conquering Africa in the world. The first stanza reads, take up the white man's burden, send forth the best you breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness, on the flattered folk and wild, your new court, sullen peoples, half devil and half child. So for him, this stanza, the white man's burden depicts concisely the European conception of itself and of the non-European. This conception unhesitatingly sees itself as the proper embodiment of human existence as such, and goes on to impose itself on the non-European who is viewed as half devil and half child. And it's important that we note that this conception by Kipling is not an isolated image, but rather an accurate articulation of European colonial consciousness, which was amply represented in the popular literature of the day, but also in the enduring conceptions and speculations of modern European thought. So in the name of universality of values, European colonialism violently universalized its own singular particularity and annihilated the historicality of the colonized. In this context, Western philosophy or theology, in the guise of disinterested universalistic and transcendental speculative discourse, served the indispensable function of being the ultimate veracious buttress of European conquest. All of these ideas of civility and in the interest of man sounded well, because for James, the question of enlightenment in modern European thought was a political orientation towards the struggle of the superstition that at the time was prevalent on the continent. And this is seen as distinct from the established Christian doctrine. Antonio Gramsci, for instance, has looked at this orientation of European thought as nothing but the presupposition of a single culture, a singular religion, a singular global conformism, that is a singular globalized cultural totality. Edward Said, for instance, speak of all of this as the result of colonialism in a colonized world. Therefore, a widely varied group of little Europes throughout Asia, Africa, and the Americas became the norm. The little Europes constituted on the African continent required the replication of European institutions and forms of life and the simultaneous depreciation and suppression as barbaric, savage, and non-human of African institutions and culture. They also required the systematic inculturation of urbanized Africans, whose very formation as a section of the dominated society was predicated on the rupture of African historical existence in the face of European violence. Thus, the Europeanized sections of colonized Africa were physically and culturally disinherited. The non-Europeanized sections, on the other hand, were forced to submit to a petrification of their indigenous cultural historical existence. This is not at all to suggest that urbanized and at various levels Europeanized Africans consciously and in this very same terms endorses the European metaphysical prejudice just mentioned, nor is it to argue that indigenous cultures were completely obliterated by colonial conquest. Instead, it is to indicate and strongly emphasize the fact that Europeanized Africans internalized negative disposition towards its own indigenousness, and its estrangement from African cultures and traditions has deep roots and finds its ultimate veracious justification in the dissolutionary metaphysical belief articulated in and out of the traditions of the West. On the other hand, the cultural historical stagnation of indigenous non-Europeanized African is itself the result of Western conquest, which is ironically used to justify this same conquest. So the colonial project of conquest has brought with it a number of challenges for the African. Most importantly, what this colonial project was able to do was to precipitate what I would like to call a flight from the black self. Francis Nyamjo was thinking of this when he argued, just as African presidents prefer to beg and bank in foreign currencies, ignoring even banknotes that bear their own faces and stamp of omnipotence, so is their preference for their foreign intellectual expert over homegrown expertise, close quote. A question that is very important for me is the question of education. And as we speak, and the discourse today that we have is the struggle over the curricula in South Africa. And education for Africans has, in the main, tended to be an exercise of self-evacuation and evaluation of all that took pre-colonial generations' wisdom, cultural creativity, and sweat to realize. The fact that Africans have placed and continue to place a very high premium on getting educated in the West or in local variants and franchises of European and North American institutions has only compounded the problem. Locating the challenge more precisely at home, Nyamjo argues that in South Africa, for example, despite numerous local universities and relatively long history of university education, a doctorate from Britain or the USA is still valued higher than anything obtained locally. Like other Africans, South Africans instinctively ask one another and others, where did you do your degree? Depending on the university you name, you could be treated as a superior, an equal, or an inferior by a fellow academic. Some Africans would rather graduate from Oxford, Harvard, or the Sorbonne, even if this means changing their specializations to accommodate the limited academic menu offered in these heavyweight Western universities. Africans continue to flood Europe and North America to research aspects of their own countries, mostly for the prestige and status that studying abroad brings, only to end up as disillusioned and incomplete Africans. Parents continue to send their children to Europe, North America, and elsewhere for education with the conviction that a degree, even from a commercialized and second-rate Western university, is worth a lot more opportunities than one from a purportedly top university in Africa. And as such universities are those generally perceived to be Western universities in Africa, such as some in South Africa, and I can name a few: Stellenbosch University, University of Cape Town, Wits University Pretoria, etc. Again, I refer to Nyamjo, who raises significant questions which must not be ignored by anyone who takes the subject of challenging the current African curricula. He asks, could this extraversion and xenophilia in matters educational explain the inability to radically transform curricula even when their irrelevance is widely recognized? Could this also explain the often ludicrous obsession with maintaining without problematizing inherited standards? Now, having dealt with the question of education, it would be remiss of me not to point to some of the challenges which I consider to be after effects of colonialism. That is rampant among Black South Africans and our African brothers north of the Limpopo River. South Africa has made news recently for quite the wrong reasons by showing intolerance to African brothers and sisters. While this intolerance is more palpable at the level of where the majority is located, and where the majority, still languish in poverty, it would be incorrect to assume that the same is not prevalent in the Black middle class. The contention among the masses is that Blacks from other parts of the continent continue to steal jobs and their women. It is funny, though, to discover that that while you have almost a great number of whites coming from other parts of Europe where they have struggling economies, these are not seen as people coming to steal the jobs, but instead the perception is that if you're Black and not South African, you are most likely here to come and steal the already scant jobs, while you're white, you are here to most likely contribute to the economy. And so these are all as a result of a liberation project that has not yielded the necessary fruits that many South Africans are experiencing, and as such, it becomes quite easy to look at the Black adder as a person, as an outlet to deal with that kind of frustration. And so these are for me the very issues that are key and that are central in the discourse that we have in South Africa today. I mean, for instance, there is quite different schools of thought on this matter. You have, for instance, the Put South Africa First, who insists that all Africans mostly who are not of South Africa are supposed to be repatriated so that we are then able to deal with South African issues. And then, of course, you have a school of thought that speaks of a united Africa and is quite critical of the borders that we created as a result of Western greed, hell-bent on exploiting, all that Africa had. And so I think, given the 10 minutes that I was given, I'm just going to pause here and take it back to you, James.